Alright, we're going to talk about chapter 24 now. Chapter 24, this will be part 1. So, question 1. Diagram below shows a hypothetical economy and the initial effect of the positive AS shock shown. So the AS curve shifted from here to here. Just reading off the graph, our short run equilibrium is greater than potential output. Potential output is where this big line is, so that gives us an inflationary gap, and the amount is just simply the difference between the equilibrium and the line, so that's 200. Pretty simple. So if the economy is currently in equilibrium at E3 right over here, the concept of asymmetrical adjustment of the AS curve suggests that. So in chapter 23 we went over the concept of sticky wages. So right over here we're in a recessionary gap. So what that means is that wages have to be falling to return us to what's going to happen in the long run. If we graph this, is in the long run. So this is our ADAS, and we're in a recessionary gap right now. ASAD. So our recessionary gap means that short run equilibrium is less than potential output. So in the long run, unless there is government intervention, it is always the AS curve that shifts. Oops, sorry, this is AT. It is always the AS curve that shifts to bring us back to long run equilibrium. So how does that work? Well, basically what we're saying here is that factor prices are going to adjust to bring us back. So things like wages, how much machines cost, etc. So our wages are going to go down to bring us back to potential output. But the problem is people don't want to take pay cuts. So this process of going from AS1 to AS2 is going to take a long time without government intervention. So what sometimes happens instead, this is price level and GDP, by the way, is the government intervenes. The government intervenes with fiscal policy. So that process is going to be really slow, and the return of the economy to potential output will be slow without government intervention. What the government can do is they can, in an event like this where they have a recession, they want to increase aggregate demand. The only time demand is going to shift is when we see the government do something. They want aggregate demand to shift to AD2. And how are they going to bring us out of a recession? Well, there's two ways they can do that. They can lower taxes. If they lower taxes, that's good for us. We're going to have more disposable income. I kind of talked about this already, but just going over it briefly. Or they can raise government purchases. They can raise G. Either of those things will bring us back here. And the argument, the concept of asymmetrical adjustment, it won't happen the same on both ways because of the sticky wages. So instead, the government should do something about it. So the return of the economy to potential output, which is long-run equilibrium, may be very slow without government intervention. Next, net tax revenues that rise with national income act as an automatic stabilizer by. So what do taxes do? So remember that our consumption function is built up of C plus YD. This little c is our autonomous consumption, the idea that we're going to consume even if we don't have income, right? Even if you don't have a job, you still need to buy food. You're going to find a way to buy that food even if you don't have a job, whether it's through employment insurance, whether it's through loans, whatever. You're going to have some autonomous consumption. The rest is your disposable income. Our disposable income, YD, is equal to our income, Y, minus taxes. So let's think about that. If there were no taxes, then we'd have more disposable income. But there's a concept of taxes as an automatic stabilizer. Automatic stabilizer. So let's look at two economies. One that has taxes equal to 10% and one that has no taxes. So in the economy where you have taxes equal to 10%, let's say that your income is $10. Your disposable income will be $9 because 10 minus 9 to taxes. Then let's say your income doubles to $20. 10% of 20 is 2, so your disposable income will be $18. On the other end here, Y and YD. If your income was 10, your disposable income would be 10. 20 gives us 20. So when your income is rising, having no taxes is a good thing. Your income rises faster. What that means, though, is that inflation happens faster as well. Let's look at it from the other end. If your income started off as 10 and then went to 5, now 10% of 5 is 1/2. So you'd actually still have $4.5. But here, if you had 10 and 10, and then your income was cut in half, now your disposable income gets cut in half as well. So here there was a change in 5, but here it was only 4.5. Here it was 5, and here it was 5. So without taxes, when your income gets cut in half, your disposable income actually gets cut in half as well. It decreases by the same proportion. But this, with taxes, the amount that you actually had went down by less. Instead of going down by 5, it only went down by 4.5. So there's the idea of taxes as an automatic stabilizer because it slows down either way, inflation or recessions. That's the idea of an automatic stabilizer. So it decreases the marginal propensity to spend. That's also using that formula, right? Z is equal to MPC times 1 minus T minus MPI. If this is 0, then your Z is going to be a lot greater, right? The bigger this T value is, notice that this is a negative sign, which means it's a inverse relationship or a negative relationship. So when T goes up, Z goes down. So if T is bigger, a greater T will give us a smaller Z value. So net tax revenues that rise decrease the marginal propensity to spend, and our simple multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus Z, and our multiplier gets bigger the smaller this denominator is, right? Because 1 over 1 is just equal to 1, but 1 over 0.9 is equal to 1.1. So when we make our Z value smaller, that makes this bottom part close to 1, which decreases the value of our simple multiplier. Decreases, causing the simple multiplier to decrease. Next question. Okay, so this says it gives 5 economies, but what's important here is just to read the question. A lot of people, you see a lot of numbers and you get a little overwhelmed. Just read this last sentence. Assume that potential output for each economy is 340 billion. And then it says, which of the statements best describes the situation facing economy B? So we can ignore A, C, D, and E. We're only looking at economy B. This rate of wage change thing also doesn't matter. All we want to look at here is what the real GDP is, 320. We notice that potential output for every economy is 340. So when our real GDP right here is less than potential, so let's say potential is 340, and our real GDP is only 320, then we are obviously in a recessionary gap. And the difference is just subtract those two numbers. It'll be the absolute value, which is 340 minus 320, which is 20. Next, which of the following is occurring as the macroeconomy is adjusting from the short run to the long run? So remember, adjusting from the short run to the long run, it's always the AS curve that's moving, unless it's the government, unless the government does something. So if the government does nothing, then the AS curve is going to move. What does that mean? That means that wages and other factor prices are adjusting to close that output gap on either end. Suppose the economy is in short-run equilibrium at Y1, right here at B. An appropriate fiscal policy for closing the output gap would be. So in the case of inflation, we do the opposite of these things. This is for a recessionary gap. So if we do the opposite, they can either raise taxes or lower government spending. So a decrease in government purchases would bring us back towards equilibrium. And because it's the government, it's going to shift our AD curve. So in the long run, we'd see an AD curve that's going through point A over there. This is the exact same question pretty much. Factor prices respond to output gaps. Same thing. So if the economy is experiencing an inflationary output gap, what's going to happen? What's going to happen in a inflationary... weird, that's fine. Work with it. Okay, cool. An inflationary gap. So we have this, and inflationary means that this point here is greater than potential output. Y star, price level, and GDP. So what's going to happen? This is AS, and this is AD. Now, unless they say government, we just assume no government, okay? So if there's no government, our AS curve is going to be the one to shift. So our AS curve shifts over here so that it intersects at equilibrium, AS2. So what happens in an inflationary gap? This will be what happens in the long run. AS curve will shift that way. This is AS1. So in an inflationary gap, there is an upward pressure on wages. So people want raises, and when people want raises, companies kind of have to give it to them, right? Because the economy's booming, they're doing well, the company's doing well, everyone should be getting their bonuses. Problem is, the company can't give too many people raises, right? Because then they're not going to be able to balance their books. So they're going to be able to hire less people, or they're not going to be able to supply the same amount of output. They're going to be able to supply less output for the given level of price level. That's the important thing. So in the long run, what's going to happen is wages rise, which means that we're going to shift this way pretty much. So wages rise, unit costs rise. Unit costs are things like, we talk about variable costs, the cost per unit. That's how much you have to pay each person to make it, how much the machine costs to make it, etc., etc. And the AS curve shifts leftward. That's how that question works. Suppose the government implements a permanent reduction in the net tax rate in an effort to increase real GDP. One disadvantage of this policy is, so we talked about the automatic stabilizer before, if there's a permanent reduction, when before we were talking about reducing taxes, whatever, that's a temporary thing. If they permanently got rid of taxes, or they permanently reduced it, then the effect of the automatic stabilizer is reduced, and the economy becomes more unstable. So we can see larger recessions or inflation, that kind of thing. This one is, again, just reading off. So there's equilibrium here. This is our potential. So there's a difference of 100 here, and we know that it's a recession. So that's it for part 1.